My name is Margaret Ellis, but everyone in my small town used to call me Maggie. Before the war changed everything, my life was simple and predictable. I lived in a quiet village in the English countryside, surrounded by green fields, narrow stone roads, and the gentle sound of church bells every Sunday morning. I was 21 years old when the war began, though sometimes it feels as if my life truly started and ended during those years. I worked at a small post office near the town square. It was a modest building with wooden counters, dusty shelves, and the constant smell of paper and ink. Every day I sorted letters, stamped envelopes, and greeted neighbors whose faces I had known since childhood. Back then, letters were more than just paper. They were pieces of people's hearts traveling across miles. Before the war, most of the letters were ordinary: birthday wishes, family news, or invitations to weddings. But everything changed after the first soldiers left our town. The letters became heavier, not in weight, but in meaning. I remember the day I first met Thomas Carter as clearly as if it were yesterday. It was a bright spring afternoon, and the sunlight was falling through the windows of the post office, warming the wooden floor. I was behind the counter organizing envelopes when the door opened. He walked in wearing a simple brown coat, his hair slightly messy from the wind. At first glance, there was nothing extraordinary about him. Yet there was something gentle in his eyes, something calm and thoughtful. "Excuse me," he said politely. "Could I buy some envelopes?" His voice was warm, soft, and careful, as though he always chose his words with kindness. I handed him a small stack of envelopes and watched as he counted the coins in his hand. When he looked up, he smiled, an honest smile that made his eyes brighten. "I suppose I'll be needing quite a few of these soon," he said. "Writing many letters?" I asked. "Trying to," he replied with a quiet laugh. "My mother worries if she doesn't hear from me." I nodded. Mothers always worried. That was something I had seen many times working at the post office. We spoke only for a few minutes that day, but when he left, I found myself watching the door long after it had closed. A week later, he returned. This time, he wasn't buying envelopes. He was mailing a letter. He placed the envelope carefully on the counter, as if it contained something fragile. "Could you make sure this goes out today?" he asked. "Of course," I replied. I noticed the neat handwriting on the envelope. It was addressed to a woman in London. His mother, I assumed. As I stamped the letter, he stood quietly, his hands folded in front of him. Then he said something unexpected. "Do you ever wonder where all these letters go after they leave here?" I looked up. "What do you mean?" He gestured toward the shelves filled with outgoing mail. "So many stories," he said. "People sending pieces of their lives to one another. Some happy, some sad. Some maybe never reaching the person they were meant for." His words surprised me. Most people never thought about letters that way. "I suppose you're right," I said. For a moment, we simply stood there, surrounded by stacks of envelopes that carried countless unseen emotions. Then he introduced himself. "My name is Thomas Carter." "Maggie," I replied. "Margaret Ellis." After that day, Thomas began visiting the post office regularly. Sometimes he mailed letters, sometimes he bought stamps, and sometimes it seemed he only came to talk for a few minutes. We spoke about simple things at first, the weather, books, and the quiet life of the town. But slowly, our conversations became longer. He told me he worked as a mechanic in a nearby garage and had always loved fixing broken things. "Machines make sense," he once said. "If something is broken, you can usually repair it." I remember smiling at that. "If only people were that simple," I replied. He laughed softly. "Yes," he said, "if only." Those months felt peaceful, almost untouched by the growing shadow of war. But beyond our small village, the world was changing rapidly. News spread quickly. Countries were fighting. Soldiers were needed. Young men from our town began leaving one by one. Some marched proudly, believing the war would end quickly. Others left quietly, fear hidden behind forced smiles. Thomas tried not to talk about it at first. But one evening, just before closing the post office, he came in again. There was something different about him that day. He held a folded paper in his hand. "I received my letter this morning," he said. I already knew what he meant. The army had called him. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, and somewhere in the distance, a train whistle echoed across the fields. "When do you leave?" I asked quietly. "In 3 days." 3 days. The words felt heavy in the air. Thomas looked down at the wooden counter, tracing a small scratch in the surface with his finger. "I've never been very good at saying goodbye," he admitted. "You don't have to say goodbye," I said softly. He looked at me, confused. "Then what should I say?" I thought about the thousands of letters that passed through my hands every week. Then an idea formed in my mind. "Write to me," I said. "Write to you?" "Yes. Letters travel farther than people sometimes, even during war." He seemed surprised by the suggestion. "But what would I write about?" "Anything," I said with a small smile. "Your days, your thoughts, your fears, your hopes." For a moment, he didn't answer. Then he nodded slowly. "All right," he said. "I'll write." The next morning, he came back to the post office with a small envelope. He placed it in my hands instead of the outgoing mail basket. "This one," he said quietly, "is for you." It was the first letter Thomas Carter ever wrote to me. At the time, I did not know that it would also be the beginning of the most beautiful and heartbreaking story of my life. And I certainly did not know that those letters would one day be the only pieces of him I had left. 3 days after Thomas received his army letter, the entire town gathered at the small train station to say goodbye to the young men who were leaving for war. The morning was gray and quiet, as if even the sky understood the sadness that hung in the air. Mothers clung to their sons. Wives held their husbands' hands tightly. Children stood confused beside their parents, too young to understand why so many grown-ups were crying. I stood a little apart from the crowd. I told myself I had no reason to be there. Thomas and I were not family. We were not even officially something that could be named. And yet my feet had carried me to the station before the sun had fully risen. Thomas spotted me almost immediately. He was wearing a dark army coat that looked slightly too large for his shoulders. A small bag hung from one hand. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then he walked toward me. "I wasn't sure you would come," he said. "I wasn't sure either," I replied honestly. There were 1,000 things I wanted to say, but the words stayed trapped somewhere inside my chest. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and handed me a small bundle tied with string. "More envelopes," he said with a faint smile. "Planning ahead?" I asked. "Planning to keep my promise." My throat tightened as I took them. The train whistle sounded loudly across the platform, cutting through the quiet conversations and soft crying. Time was running out. Thomas looked at me with that same gentle expression I had first seen in the post office. "I will write as often as I can," he said. "You must promise to reply." "I promise," I said. For a brief moment, he hesitated, as if unsure whether he should do what he was thinking. Then he reached forward and hugged me. It was quick and awkward, but it felt warm and real. And then he stepped away. The train doors closed. Soldiers climbed aboard. The engine roared to life. As the train slowly pulled away, I watched Thomas standing by the window. He lifted his hand in a silent goodbye. I waved back, though my vision had already begun to blur with tears. That evening, I opened the first letter he had given me. The paper was slightly wrinkled, as if he had folded and unfolded it many times before finally sealing it. Inside, his handwriting was neat and careful. "Dear Maggie," the letter began. "I know I promised to write once I reached the army camp, but I realized something today. I did not want the first letter you received from me to be written from a place filled with fear or uncertainty. I wanted it to come from a peaceful moment while the memory of home was still fresh." I read those lines again and again. It was strange how a simple piece of paper could suddenly make someone feel less alone. Over the following weeks, the post office became both my workplace and my waiting place. Every morning, I sorted through hundreds of envelopes, secretly hoping to see Thomas's familiar handwriting among them. The first real letter arrived 12 days after he left. I recognized the writing immediately. My hands trembled as I opened it. "Dear Maggie," he wrote, "the training camp is noisy and crowded. There are men from all over the country here, each carrying their own stories and worries. Some are brave, some pretend to be brave. I suspect I belong to the second group." I smiled sadly at that. Thomas continued describing the camp, the long days of drills, the cold mornings, and the endless marching. But between the lines, I could feel something deeper: loneliness. At the end of the letter, he wrote something that made my heart ache. "I keep thinking about the post office. I imagine you standing behind a counter, stamping letters with that serious look on your face. It is a strange comfort, knowing that somewhere in the world there is a quiet place where life still feels normal." After reading it, I wrote my reply that very night. I told him about the town, about the old bakery that had started making smaller loaves because flour was scarce, and about Mrs. Grant's cat that had somehow managed to sneak into the post office again. I tried to make the letter light and cheerful. I wanted him to feel that home was still waiting for him. Weeks turned into months. Our letters traveled across countries and battle lines, crossing oceans of uncertainty. Sometimes they arrived quickly, sometimes they were delayed for weeks, but they always came. Thomas wrote about everything he saw: the muddy camps, the endless marching, the nervous jokes soldiers told each other to hide their fear. Yet he never wrote about violence in detail. It was as if he was trying to protect me from the harshest parts of the war. One evening, nearly a year after he had left, I received a letter that felt different. The envelope was worn and stained, as if it had traveled a long and difficult journey. Inside, the handwriting looked slightly rushed. "Dear Maggie," it began, "I am writing this letter from somewhere in France. I cannot tell you exactly where, but I can tell you that the nights here are very quiet." That sentence stayed with me. Very quiet. He continued, "Sometimes the silence is almost frightening. It makes you think about things you usually try to forget, about home, about the people you miss. My chest tightened as I read the next line. You are the person I think about most. I read that sentence again, slowly, letting the words sink in. Outside the post office window, the evening sun was beginning to disappear behind the hills. Thomas ended the letter with something simple. When this war ends, Maggie, I would like to come back to that small post office and buy a single envelope. But instead of writing letters, I would like to start a life. My heart beat faster as I folded the letter carefully. For the first time since the war had begun, I allowed myself to imagine a future beyond the letters. A future where Thomas Carter would walk through the post office door again. But war has a cruel way of changing even the most hopeful dreams. And soon, the letters that once arrived so faithfully would begin to grow farther and farther apart. As the war continued, the rhythm of my life became measured by letters. Each morning, I woke up hoping that the post delivery would bring another envelope with Thomas's familiar handwriting. Each evening, I went to sleep wondering where he was and whether he was safe. For a long time, the letters kept coming. Sometimes they were long and thoughtful. Other times they were short, written quickly between duties, but each one carried his voice, his quiet humor, and the gentle kindness that had first drawn me to him in the little post office. Then, slowly, something began to change. The letters started arriving less often. At first, I told myself it was normal. War made everything unpredictable. Mail could be delayed. Soldiers moved constantly. But weeks began to pass without any news. The waiting became unbearable. Every time the mail truck stopped outside the post office, my heart would race. I would sort through the envelopes quickly, hoping to see his name. Most days, I did not. Still, I continued writing. Even when I did not know where he was stationed, I sent letters to the last address he had given me. I told him about the changing seasons in our town, about the harvest festivals that felt strangely quiet without so many young men, and about how the old church bell still rang every Sunday morning. I tried to keep hope alive in every word. Then, one cold winter afternoon, a letter finally arrived. The envelope looked worn and slightly torn at the edges, as though it had traveled through many hands before reaching mine. But I recognized the handwriting immediately. Thomas. My hands trembled as I opened it. The paper inside was creased and stained with faint marks of mud. Dear Maggie, it began, if you are reading this letter, it means the mail system has performed one more small miracle. I frowned slightly at those words. He continued, the last few weeks have been difficult. Our unit has been moved several times, and we have seen things that are hard to describe. But somehow, in the middle of all this chaos, I keep thinking about the quiet life waiting back home. I could almost hear his voice as I read. The truth is, he wrote, your letters have become the brightest part of my days. When the world around me feels dark and uncertain, I remember the post office, the wooden counter, and the girl who believed letters could travel farther than fear. Tears began forming in my eyes. Then I reached the final paragraph. Maggie, there is something I must say, though I should have said it long ago. Writing to you has changed my life in ways I never expected. Somewhere between the first envelope and this letter, I realized that I was not simply writing to a friend. My heart pounded as I read the next words. I was writing to the woman I love. For a moment, I could not breathe. Outside the window, Snow had begun falling softly across the quiet streets of our town. Thomas's letter continued, "I do not know what tomorrow will bring. War is unpredictable, and none of us can see the future clearly. But if fate is kind and I return home, I would like to stand in that little post office again and ask you something important." The sentence stopped there for a moment, as if he had paused while writing. Then the final lines appeared. "I would like to ask if you will spend the rest of your life with me." My tears fell freely onto the paper. At the very bottom of the page, he added one more sentence. "If I cannot come back, please remember that somewhere in this world there was a soldier who carried your letters in his pocket and your name in his heart." That was the last letter I ever received from Thomas Carter. Weeks later, an official telegram arrived at the post office. I did not need to read it to understand what it meant. The war had taken him. For a long time after that day, I continued working at the post office. Letters still arrived and left every day, carrying the hopes and fears of countless people. But none of them were ever meant for me again. Years have passed since the war ended. The town has changed. The world has changed. But in a small wooden box beside my bed, I still keep every letter Thomas ever wrote. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, I take them out and read them again. The paper has grown fragile with time, but the words remain strong. They remind me that love can travel across oceans, across battlefields, and even across time itself. And perhaps that is the true power of letters. They allow voices from the past to continue speaking long after the writers are gone. If this story touched your heart, and if you enjoy learning English through emotional and meaningful stories like this one, I warmly invite you to join my YouTube channel. On my channel, Listen and Learn English, you will discover many more powerful stories designed to help you improve your English while experiencing unforgettable journeys of love, courage, and life. So please subscribe to Listen and Learn English and continue learning English through stories that stay with you long after the final word.